Hey guys, Styx here again, and today I'm going to be doing one of the most requested things on my channel and on YouTube for this game ever. I'm making a tier list for the early to mid game in Mythic Heroes from every single hero in the game. This is an up-to-date list, and it will be updated as you go on. If you would like the link, I will link it to it down in the description. Feel free to leave a comment, like, subscribe, anything if you want to see more. This is just to give you a good idea of who's good, who's not so good in the early to mid game. Okay, we're going to start off. Aladdin. I don't know much about Aladdin. I know that he's just recently came out, and he gives buffs to your team. He's a support type. And I think just given that he is just a buff for your team, and it's not, if I'm not mistaken, he does like random things. And given that, I'd probably put him somewhere in like, probably B at best. Just because in the early game you're really trying to go for the bare bones minimum, like the skeleton crew of a team. So you're looking for like tanks and healers and damage, and that's it. Team buffs are kind of for later in the game, in my eyes. So that's where I'm going to put him here for now. Amaterasu in the early game is probably in the same area. Reason being is she's a UR, so if you are going to build her up, she is going to be lower level. Actually, for that matter, I might want to put her in C because, again, she is a UR, and for those URs, I don't think you should be going for those in the early game. I just don't think it's going to be economically intelligent for you. But yeah, even though she is a UR, she does have incredible damage against bosses, and if you're trying to go for those higher scores and you do want to build up a single UR specifically for bosses, she's the way to go. So until you get more resources in the later game, she's really not worth it because there's just so much content and so much grinding you have to do in the early game that she doesn't really excel at. So Anubis, in the early game, I probably am also going to put him in B, given the fact that he doesn't really do much in the way of survivability in PvP. Or normal PvE. He really only does things against bosses from what I've seen. He can stay alive a little bit, but he's not really doing any damage, and that's not really where you want to be in the early game. So definitely, I think B tier. Apollo, probably A tier. He doesn't like to die, no matter what stage you are in the game. He's not the easiest hero to come by, I'll give it that. So he's not like in a shop or anything where he's super easy to access, but I think he will perform well for you no matter what stage of the game you're in. This is very much updated from my first video, for my impressions of him, but yeah, I think he's a solid pick for fighter slash tank, even though he's technically classified as a fighter. Archimedes in the early game, when you don't have access to that full team, is probably B tier as well. Just if you don't have the right team setup, he's not really doing all too much. Like, he can do some damage, sure, and that's why I have him in B rather than C or D. But I don't think he's going to be doing what you want him to do for your team unless you have that specific team setup. If you guys do want to see what that team setup is and how it works, I can make another video on that in the near future. If you'd like to see that, leave a comment, let me know. But moving on, Artemis, probably A tier. Just a really good assassin, easy to get. She's a Luminarch, so there's a bunch of those, so it's all plentiful. Not that hard to build either, and she just does good damage against single targets. And in arenas in the early game, I was getting absolutely obliterated by Artemis teams, so there you go. Athena, S tier. Early game, she does everything for you. Like, she, as you level her up, she's going to give you more shields, she's going to heal you, she's going to take less damage, she's going to refuse to die, she's going to give your entire team flexibility, a little bit of damage on her own, and she's probably just the best tank in the early game, period. And that's why I believe she 100% belongs in S tier in the early game. And creeping up into the mid game, once you get into higher level play, she actually remains kind of in the same area, S or A, but that's for a different video. That's the one I'll be uploading next, I believe. So, Cassandra as a healer, A tier. In the early game, she does more than in the late game. I think as a healer in the early game, she's a very solid option. She gives you a lot of HP all at once, and then it dwindles over time. And as you increase that, it gets kind of a diminishing returns type thing. So in the early game, I think she does do well. I just don't think she has the same future proofing as some of the other healers that we'll get to in a minute. Chiron, I honestly don't know really anything about. In the early game, I kind of want to put him somewhere in here because I haven't seen him really anywhere. That might just be because he's new. Again, I don't know too much about him. First, to be safe, I'll put him in C. From what I've seen, he does like some damage, and he like teleports around and has high defenses and has a passive that uh, gives him a bunch of survivability. So that's kind of nice. But in the early game, you're looking for someone that excels at one thing in particular to build your team around to start with. So I don't think he's really going to be where you want to be in the early game. Cleopatra in the early game, I want to put her in D, but I don't think she belongs there. I think C is a comfortable spot for her. She does some poison damage, some damage over time, and that's fine. That's all well and good, except her raw damage, from what I've seen, is not great. She does have that big burst, that big explosion, which can be nice, but honestly, like, there are so many better DPSers that I don't think she really belongs up here with the rest of them, so that's why she's down there. Dangun, in the early game, he's straddling the line here. I'm gonna put him in C as well, because first off, he's a UR, which means he's really difficult to get. He's not really in any of the shops, and I think that's because no one likes him. Like from the testing that I saw, he's really really random. His buffs are just entirely random. It doesn't matter what's going on in the fight. Sometimes they'll give you something completely useless, and then you just kind of have to deal with it. So you kind of have to redo for that god run, and in PvP, that doesn't fly. So he really doesn't shine in multiple content, only in a certain subset, and only in the later game, and even then, it's kind of a toss-up. So I really don't think he's where you want to be in the early game. Dionysus. In the early game, probably a B tier, because he is kind of the only debuff hero that you're going to be using in the early game if you know what you're doing. And I think he's good for a couple of different bosses and a couple of pieces of content, but as a main team support in the early game, I don't think he's really going to be worth it. His value is just really high elsewhere, so like in a couple of different boss fights, he can do wonders for you, but outside of that, he's really not doing all too much. And that's why I want to put him kind of in B in that area. Faust in the early game, probably B as well. I'm slightly overpopulating B here, but it's true. He does a lot of damage. He teleports. He does a lot of damage, but he also dies quickly because his ultimate deals damage to himself. So until you get later into the game, he's not going to be doing exactly what you want him to do, and for that reason, I kind of think he's mid for the early game. So you can invest in him if you want. Just as a main DPS, I don't think he's really going to get there for you for what you want to do. So Flora, Flora's a rough one. I want to put her in C. I think that's comfortably where she should go. She's similar to Zeus in a lot of ways. She does AOE damage, and that's kind of it. Like, she has certain single target things. When that ult goes off, it can do a lot of damage, but also she's pretty fragile. If she gets hit enough, she just dies. Like, there's really no inbuilt survivability. And she doesn't really have any self buffs either, and so she's really vanilla. And there are better DPSers, and that's why I want to put her down here. She might not deserve it, but who knows? We'll have to see. Freya, I think I want to do the same. Um, I've seen her do a lot of damage before. I saw a replay of a guild boss fight where she did stupid amounts of damage, but that was at a very high level. And in the early game with Freya, because she is such a unique and specific damage dealer, you have to have the exact right equipment, the exact right setup to be able to use her to her full efficiency and effectiveness. And in the early game, you don't have access to that kind of thing. So I don't think she is exactly what you want to be doing in the early game like the rest of these. Gabriel, named after me. Yeah, I'll put her in B. It's just because do she doesn't do really anything. You know what? No, I'm put her in C. She doesn't really do anything. She has that water veil, and she can like stop some damage, I suppose. I read her abilities when she first came out. There was nothing particularly exciting there. And in the early game, again, you do want someone who excels at one particular thing to build your team around, and she's not doing that. So as a normal support later, she's fine. I can do that in the other tier list, but for now, I think that's probably where she belongs. Gaia in the early game, I have to put her in D. Like here's the thing about Gaia. She's fine on a defensive team. On a main team, on an offensive team, she will suck. She does absolutely no damage, and until you get her entirely leveled up, she doesn't even stay alive as long as you want her to. She's just not doing what you want. She's nowhere near Athena as far as like power level goes because she doesn't buff your team. She's supposed to be a DPS while at the same time staying alive as a tank, and it just doesn't work, especially in the early game when you don't have access to those same kind of things. So I don't think she's very good at all. G and M. Um, I'm t- I think I have to put them at the top of A. Um, Come on, because until the late game, you don't really have access to that double ult, which is fine. But um, and I know they got a buff semi recently where they get back health if they have full energy after that first or second ult, whatever you have them leveled up to. They do some damage. They do some AoE damage. That's fine. They do some single target damage as well. That's all well and good. They give themselves buffs, so they are very good. I just don't think they are absolute top tier. That I reserve for just a couple of heroes. Although maybe I'm wrong, actually. I'm wondering if I am wrong there. In the early, you know what? In the early game, I think GNM is up there. They're so easy to get. They give themselves buffs. They do AOE damage. They do single target damage. They worked for me as my main DPS for the entire early to mid game. And if they carried me that far, I think they deserve the S tier. Hades in the early game. Um, I sure I'll put him in B. Um, he does fine. He has the summon. He has the Hellhound, which does some extra damage, gives you some extra survivability, and that's all well and good. He can finish off enemies with his ultimate. Once they're below a certain amount of HP, he can just finish them off. That's perfectly good. But there are other tanks, namely Athena, that do his job better than him. I don't exactly know why he's classified as a tank. I suppose because he has the high defense and he has like maybe one passive that gives him survivability. But yeah, I don't know. He just seems lackluster in the early game. Even though he is pretty easy to get, I don't think he is exactly what you want to do. Of course, you can build him. That's perfectly fine. But yeah, I kind of think he should belong here. Hela, for certain teams, Hela is a very good healer in the early game. She gives you lifesteal, she gives you HP, and she slows down time around her. So she has her own built in survivability if enemies try to get close. And she can do a lot for a team that focuses on lifesteal, which is really nice. And because of that, I think for a healer in those teams, she is probably A tier. Actually, probably in front of Cass, specifically for those kinds of teams. But outside of that, she kind of okay. Hercules, D. No further questions. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't stay alive. He doesn't do any damage. It has no special effects. He's the most vanilla hero ever, and he's just not worth it at all in my eyes from what I've seen. So, Idun as a healer in the early game, I think Idun and Naga are gonna have to go in S tier, and I'll actually find Naga right now. These two are basically comparable. They do slightly different things. Like Idun gives you more energy, whereas Naga gives you more HP and then shields if it goes beyond your HP. And they can just keep your team alive for so long. As main healers throughout the entire game, I think they're both really, really good, and you can use either one or both and find a whole lot of success. And for that reason, because they are the best healers in the game, no matter what stage of the game you're in, I think they definitely belong in S tier together. Iset in the early game, I want to put her in C. So when I first came into this game, she was broken. She didn't actually do anything. But now that I know exactly what she does and I've played against her, in the high level gameplay that I play at, specifically in arenas, she can do a decent amount. But I'm not seeing her very consistently. And if I'm not seeing her consistently in high level play, and she's a UR, she's definitely not going to be what you want to do in the early game at all. She doesn't do enough. She's not even a healer technically. She's a support, so she can like revive your allies and she can do some buffs and things, but honestly, like if you're going to go for a hero like that, just pick someone better. Pick two different ones that are more readily accessible and something like that. It'll make life so much easier. Moving on, yeah, I'm putting Izanami in S tier. Just as a DPS, she is above and beyond in the early game and even into the late game. She does damage to the entire enemy team all at once, which is great. She does consistent and good damage while at the same time draining their life and giving herself heals using her ultimate, which is absolutely wonderful. She got a buff a few months ago that makes her a strong contender for one of the best heroes in the early game out there. So I definitely think you should be picking up Izanami if you can in the early game. Joan of Arc, for survivability, she does something. I just don't think she does the same kind of thing as Athena. She makes a little area of effect where your heroes get a whole bunch of defense, or at least last I checked. I think she got changed recently, but yeah, from what I know of her, she can do some work for you. There are just better options in the survivability category that I think will work better for you. And so I think because of that, you shouldn't exactly look exclusively into building her up. If you want to, you certainly can. She will do something for you, but there are some better options. So I think you should probably not be too adamant on her. Leonidas, I'm probably going to put in A tier. He's technically classified as a tank, but he kind of works as a fighter. He stays alive for quite a while, and he does enough damage to warrant being up here. As you get him leveled up, he is going to get better, but in the high level play, I haven't seen too much of him. But he is sometimes pretty tough to kill. And because he can act as either a tank or a fighter, he has some flexibility in that early game team where you want, say, one tank or two tanks, and then one or two fighters or whatever. This can act as a flex spot, so you can kind of have the best of both worlds. So in value, and especially being a Guardian DPS similar to GNM, in value, I think he performs quite well. So Lilith, hey, I'm gonna put her in B tier. Again, another UR hero, which means you should not go for her specifically in the early game because it's really difficult. You can slowly build her up, and that's fine. But no matter what stage of the game you're in, you're going to run into Susano, you're going to run into Artemis, you're going to run into these assassins that just Shrek her. Like there's no contest because she's super squishy. She dies very quickly, and while she can do some damage, and when she gets that ult off, when she's high level, she can absolutely wipe the floor with a team. But if they have even a little bit of shields up, it does nothing. So, yeah, she's kind of inconsistent. She dies pretty easily. She's a UR, but she can do a whole truckload of damage. So I think I'm going to put her here for now. Loki, I'm going to put him in A tier. Maybe the top of A tier, because he is very good. His stat line is bonkers. When I first read him, I thought he was going to be broken. He kind of is. There's really only one downside to Loki, and that's when he uses his ultimate, he jumps around to all the different enemies, and then sometimes he will leave them on like no HP and then not finish them off, and then they can just heal right back up. And this is an issue with him at any stage in the game, but in the early game when you're trying to go specifically for wins, like say in arena, that doesn't work as well as you'd want it to. However, he still does a lot of damage. He stays alive for a long time. He's just overall a really good fighter. And he makes clones of himself, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, he's certainly a solid option if you want to go for a DPS. Yeah, moving on. Lu Bu. Yeah, I'm gonna put him in B. He's like Susano, except not. Like he has his ultimate is the only thing that does really anything. And while it does do a lot of damage, I mean, if you get it off, that's great. But he doesn't offer the same kinds of things as Susano does. And I think in the early game, if there is a better option and someone who's easier to access, you should just go for them rather than the technically worse one. And so I think Lu Bu is overshadowed by a whole lot of other DPSers that do more. So I think he belongs probably in B for the early game. Lucifer. Um, I have personal bias toward Lucifer, but honestly, in the early game, like B, maybe. Again, he's a UR, so he's really difficult to get. Um, and I mean, he does fine, but he doesn't do as much damage as some other heroes. Uh, he can sometimes his ultimate can just not go off when you're in the middle of a fight when it's supposed to. I don't exactly know why. Um, but yeah, sometimes he'll be missing out on some damage. Sometimes he can get caught up in something and die really fast. And his damage overall isn't perfect. Plus, he's a UR, so he's really difficult to get unless you spend a whole lot of money. And for that reason, I think I'm gonna put him upwards in B tier, but I don't think he belongs at the very top. So T and M, yeah, I'm gonna put her in S. Because I think she belongs there as a as just a mage, a DPS. She does a whole lot. Um, Kind of she and Izanami do similar things. One is AOE, one is kind of single target. She summons firefoxes and then does a whole lot of fire burst to a single target that then swaps over to another enemy if they get killed or whatever. She does a lot of damage. She teleports constantly, so she's really difficult to track down, and that can buy you some time. Um, and that's all well and good. Plus, she is one of the only Verdian DPSs in the game, and for that reason, her value continues into the late game, and that makes her definitely a contender for one of the top DPSers in the early game. Marduk, in the early game, C tier. In the late game, he's broken, like beyond busted. But in the early game, first off, he's a UR again, so very difficult to get. He actually just entered the arena shop. He hadn't been in there ever before, so. But yeah, I think he probably deserves to be like up here. But yeah, he's a tank, so he's supposed to stay alive. But unless you have him leveled up to a very high level, he's not going to have the same abilities that he does in the late game that help him stay alive for so long. And because his damage is kind of mediocre, otherwise, even though his ultimate can, I suppose, kill some enemies, if he gets stopped in the middle of it, or if his ultimate doesn't kill an enemy, he's a sitting duck. And you really want your damage to be consistent if you're going to be using them in the early game, and for that reason, I think he belongs at the top of C, maybe in front of Amaterasu. Medusa in the early game, also probably C tier. I mean, what is there really to say? Unless you have a full team leveled up with an AoE damage dealer, and in the late game, she's not really gonna do it. I mean, she freezes enemies and she helps you do more damage to them, and that's fine. Yeah, no, you know what? Maybe she belongs in B tier. But she helps with damage, but she's just a support. She's not a healer, she's not a tank, and she's not a fighter. So her value in the early game for those kinds of either arenas teams or PvE teams, something like that, isn't going to be as wonderful as it is later down the line. Particularly in a team like mine, you know, I have Lucifer as an AoE, and I could have Medusa. She would do well, very well there. But until you have a specialized type of team to run her, I don't think she's going to be exactly what you want. Nephthys, C. She's just a worse Izanami. She like literally does almost all the same things, except not to the same level. I have not seen her in really any gameplay at all. And so I think it's just better to go for Izanami anyway, because she is more readily accessible. She's the same faction. Like, this is just a really sad version of Izanami. So I don't think you should be going for her in the early game. You can if you're in the late game and you want to build up your roster some more, that's fine, but until then, I don't think she's really worth it. Nua as a support is very good in general, but again, because she's a UR, I want to put her in B tier. It's rough because I think Nua is a very good support. I said that before. But I also think that because she's a UR, she's very difficult to get. And in the early game, again, for supports, all you really want is healers, and she doesn't really do that. She gives you some damage boosts, but that doesn't exactly help until your team has the survivability to last that long to begin with. And at that point, you're just struggling because you only have one DPS, and it's not usually not enough in an offense team in the early game. So for that reason, I think she belongs in B tier. Oberon, probably A tier. His damage is solid. His survivability is also solid. He's just a good hero overall. As a DPS, he doesn't exactly reach TNM levels, but I think he does well enough that you can easily consider him as a DPS option, and he will perform for you, but there's really not much else to say. Oda Nobunaga. So, again, he's a UR, but because he's so absolutely busted, I'm going to put him at the top of A tier. Okay, so hear me out on this. So he is a UR, which means he is very difficult to get, and actually more difficult to get than almost any other UR because he's not in any of the shops yet. So there's really no consistent way of being able to get copies of him, which makes things really difficult. However, he has the most stupid amount of damage I've ever seen in my life. Like, it's it's unbelievable what this man is able to do in a fight. As a main DPS, he'll carry you through the entire game up into the late game if you're able to actually get him. But again, don't focus all of your time, effort, and resources on a specific UR or URs in general. You will find a lot more success doing any of these up here or any of the other SSRs that are more easily accessible. They'll just help you so much in leveling up your heroes to get to a point where you can then invest into URs. So until then, I don't think you should go for him, but when you can, absolutely worth it. Probably the best hero, best DPS in the game, period. So Odin, B tier, probably. He's a tank, but he doesn't stay alive as long as you want him to. In comparison to Athena, she lasts like forever. In the early game, he doesn't really. He doesn't have that same damage reduction type thing. He doesn't give your entire team buffs. He gives one hero buffs, and then he stops enemies' ultimates, which is fine. But until you get him leveled up, that silence duration is like nothing. So he doesn't provide the same amount of value as he does in the late game at all. And because of that, I think he belongs in B with the rest of these guys. Persephone in the early game, I hate to say it, but she's in D tier. She debuffs the enemy team, which is fine in the late game. In the early game, she is dead space. You are using her because she's filler in your team. You have no one better to use, and that's not where you want to be in the early game. In the early game, you want every single one of your heroes in your team to do something, and she just doesn't. She's not supposed to do damage, right? So if she's not one of those three types I talked about before, and if she just fills up a spot in your team, I don't think she's worth it in the early game, and hardly worth it going into the late game. So there you go. Poseidon as a tank, I'm gonna put him at the top of B tier. In the early game, like all the Poseidons I've run across in my entire time playing this game have been difficult to kill. He makes a whirlpool that sucks all your heroes in, stuns them, and then when they come back out, he's fully healed, and then it takes ages to whittle him down because his defenses are so high, and his passive definitely helps keep him alive. So as a tank, he functions quite well. He doesn't necessarily give your team any buffs or anything, but he's supposed to be kind of a secondary half DPS kind of thing, and because of the way he functions in a team, I think he deserves this place. If you are going for someone who's a tank who can do some damage, Leonidas is another option, but for that category, he works just as fine. Or not just as well, but he works as well. Susano, probably A tier, starting off. In arenas, he does everything all at once. He does stupid amounts of damage to one target, and usually in the early game, if you can take out their one healer, that's enough. You can just stop the team from working right then and there. And if you can surgically extract a hero from their team at the beginning of the fight, you're probably going to win. And because his damage doesn't scale too stupidly much with level, he starts with most of his damage to begin with. And because of all of that, plus he has a stun at the beginning, I think he deserves the spot up here at the top. Thor, don't do it. Don't fall into the trap. You shouldn't do it. In the early game, he will not work for you. He won't do what you want him to do. He doesn't really have any damage. It's a rough time. I'll say that. It's a rough time if you're trying to make Thor work. his damage isn't really up to snuff. And as a tank, like he's supposed to stay alive for a while, and I guess he kind of does, but he just doesn't excel at anything at all. And so I've never found a team where he's actually been helpful to the end goal. And because of that, I think he deserves this D tier along with the others. Titania, I know approximately not much about her. She's the one hero I actually still don't have. But given what I saw, she probably deserves like middle of B tier. She just spams skills like over and over and over again. Those active skills just go off over and over. Can buff your team, debuff the enemy team, deal damage, do a whole lot of stuff at the same time. But she's not a pure DPS and she's not a pure support. And because she doesn't necessarily fall into a specific category, she's kind of a limbo character. So you can use her in any of a number of slots, which I guess is helpful, but she, again, doesn't necessarily excel at anything in particular. And because of that, B tier, I think, is where she belongs. Typhon in the early game, bottom of B tier, probably. In the late game, he is one of the best heroes in the game, period, maybe the best. But in the early game, he doesn't have the same value. If your heroes die, they come back as snakes, which is cool, and he buffs your entire team with attack and defense, but he also drains their health. And when you're trying to keep your team alive in the early game using these healers, this tank, whatever, that doesn't really fly, particularly in like PvP where everybody's trying to kill everybody. He'll buff up your damage, I guess, but he also comes at the cost of paying a bunch of health for it. And in the early game, that's okay, I guess, if you have a really defensively based team. But if you're trying to go for offense, he doesn't do it. Because in the early game, if you have one DPS on your team, it's not enough. So he functions as a tank just fine, but he's also a UR. That's the other thing about him. He is difficult to obtain, even though he is in some shops, and that's all well and good. He's really hard to get overall, and building him up is going to take a lot more resources. Plus, he's kind of a mediocre to good, I guess, tank. But because he's a UR, I had to put him in B tier. Western Queen is fine, probably top of B tier. I think... So she buffs one singular ally hero, and if you're aiming to make your primary DPS the highest power hero on your team, like I do with my Lucifer, she will help do some damage, gain some energy, do all of that. But if you remove her from the equation, what's it really doing? If she dies in a fight, it's kind of okay, because your team can function without her, which is fine, but also it shows that it's not entirely dependent on her, so she's not doing quite as much as you'd like. She can definitely help, like if you have one main DPS, she does a lot for you, but in the early game, you don't want to have just one DPS on your team, so I think B tier is where she'll reside. YSS, probably A tier. Yeah, probably up to like here. He stays alive, he, I believe, buffs your team, he does some damage, and as a tank, he functions, like he works. Not really too much to say about him. He just works as a tank, and if you want to build a tank in the Guardian faction, do it. Like he'll work for you moving into the late game. He gets worse over time, but you know. Zeus, probably also B tier, even in the early game. Top of B though. Reason being, while he does AoE damage and stuns enemies, keeping him alive can be a little bit difficult, especially when you have these Susanos running around in arena and such. And if he dies, then your DPS is done, right? His self buffs are kind of mid. His damage is good, and it stuns enemies, which is also good. But if they dodge it, or if say a shield happens and then he doesn't go through it, he just doesn't really do anything. Because he just has one hit to the entire enemy team all at once, and if something goes wrong and that one hit doesn't work, you're fresh out of luck. So I think B tier is correct for him. And the brand new hero that I can't remember the name of, this is entirely my fault. I don't know where to put her, honestly, because I haven't seen what she can do. I saw the numbers look quite good, but she doesn't have the same kind of buffs and things that I'd want. She has a very vanilla kit, just very high numbers, and I'm not entirely sure where to put her yet. So stay tuned for that. I might do a little bit more research on my own, but from what I've seen, I don't know. We'll figure it out. But yeah, that's my tier list. That's the final product. If you guys agree or disagree with me, let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more. Hit the bell if you want to be notified every time I upload. Or do none of those. It's all up to you. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it's semi-accurate to what you're thinking. I hope it provides some help in the future. And yeah, I guess I'll see you guys whenever I do another one of these.